Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Glenda Pereira, and I am an assistant professor within the University of Maine Cooperative Extension, as well as an assistant professor within the School of Food and Agriculture. I wanted to take this time to share this video about myself and discuss a bit of my research that I have conducted previously. Because I have been in this role for a little over 2 months. And so I haven't had the opportunity to meet everybody that is involved within the dairy industry. So I wanted to introduce myself, let you know a little bit about my background and who I am, so that when I meet you sometime in the future and meet those involved within the dairy industry and other livestock industries in the future, then you already are familiar with who I am. And I also want to mention that in this presentation, I'll be sharing some products that I have conducted research with, and I do not endorse any of these products. Simply, I've done research with these specific products. So in my first slide here, I have some pictures from my childhood and from recent as well. So I actually grew up, was born and raised in the Azores, which are a couple of islands off the coast of Portugal. And on the main island, which is the island of São Miguel, there's actually 50,000 lactating dairy cows, 100 of those of which are on the dairy farm that is owned by my family. So here's a picture of myself in the early 1990s with my grandma. And you can see that we have some Holstein cows here in the back. And then recently, I was visiting over the winter time, and this is a picture of my dad and I fencing for our dry cows. So because the weather is very favorable in the winter and in the summer, dairy producers are able to take advantage of the favorable conditions for and utilize grazing and pasture to their benefit. So I wanted to share that. And then I wanted to share a bit of my background in my education. So I actually moved to the United States when I was 10 years old, and I went on to pursue a degree in animal science at the University of Rhode Island. And in between my undergraduate and graduate career, I was able to do an internship at Worldwide Sires, as well as the University of Minnesota. And that actually is where I started my passion in my career in research. So in this picture here, I was doing some of my earlier research, which was under another graduate student. So I was an undergrad at the time, but we were collecting fly behaviors to understand the fly pressure of cows on a pasture-based system. This is a picture of myself with an excellent cow at one of the California dairies. And then it was actually really cool to revisit some of the dairies in California with my PhD advisor, Dr. Red Hines. And so here we are in California in a freestall herd. So I did do my master's and my PhD both at the University of Minnesota, advised under Dr. Brad Hines. And some of the research that I was able to conduct was revolved around utilizing precision dairy technologies and specifically wearables. So a wearable is something that the cow physically wears. So in this picture, this cow is wearing an ear tag. Wearables are different from, for example, automated technologies, which can be robotic milking systems, automatic calf feeders, etc. So we actually got to validate and create a grazing behavior for a wearable because this company saw that there was sort of a need to develop a different grazing behavior because grazing is unique where the cow isn't just eating, the cow is also moving as she is consuming her feed. So that behavior is a bit different than what you would consider eating in a freestall or a confined dairy operation. I did do a lot of research around activity and rumination of cows in a confined herd versus in a pasture-based and organic herd, as well as detecting the accuracy of a wearable for estrus detection. So a lot of dairy producers rely on wearables to help with estrus detection. And that is one of the great benefits of precision dairy technologies and wearables, is that they are reliable at detecting estrus. But there are challenges on a pasture-based system with the types of behavior that the cows express. For example, during the summer on pasture, there may be more heat stress or even more fly pressure. The cows are walking to get their feed. So that creates some challenges. And so we decided it was important to sort of understand the estrus detection accuracy of some of those wearables. And then during my PhD, we switched gears a bit, where I focused on some research revolving around crossbreeding. And we were able to take some body and other measurements of crossbreds and compare those to Holstein, and do the same with our calving traits, and then look at feed efficiency of crossbreds compared to Holsteins, and whether or not crossbreds were more feed efficient on a high fiber, low starch diet. So similar to my master's, a lot of the research that I've conducted is driven by producer questions. So it's applied research. And so we find a lot of value in this research because it's directly applicable to dairy producers, and it provides dairy producers with more information to how they can better implement management practices on their dairy operations. And of course, a part of our graduate experience is that we get to collaborate with other students on their research. So other students were conducting research at the same time that I was, of course. So I got to collaborate on some research around grazing, calf and heifer rearing. We got to do some genomic testing research, looking at milk quality, fatty acid profiles, looking at the A2 beta casein protein, which some find that is actually milk from that protein, milk solely from cows that have that protein is better digestible. And then I got to do a fun project where we looked at the factors that drove livestock development in South Dakota. And while I am in Extension today, Extension has always been a big part of my graduate experience because my PhD advisor was also in Extension. So I think this experience at the University of Minnesota really prepared me for the role that I am in today. From writing lay articles for the public and for easier to digest content than our scientific articles, to being invited to speak about dairy production in the Azores, as well as some of the research that I conducted on a podcast. And if you want to hear more about that, you can log on to whatever platform you use and then look up the Newsroom, and you can search my name, and you can find a little bit more about the research that I conducted. To engaging with the public. And that was a really unique experience because I think that it's important that the public and consumers know how dairy production occurs in the United States and how dairy is part of our everyday diet. And of course, I had some opportunities to teach and sort of engage with youth in 4-H as well as undergraduate students. So I've prepared some webinars. I've participated heavily in 4-H here, helping some students prepare their calves, and as well as mentoring and helping students during the undergraduate experience. And here we have an undergraduate student collecting body measurements for our cows in our research herd. And that led me to where I am today. So I was hired at the University of Maine about 3 months ago. So I've been in this position for a little over 2 months. And so I do have a split appointment where I am an assistant professor within the University of Maine Cooperative Extension and the state dairy specialist, and in addition to being an assistant professor in the School of Food and Agriculture. So I look forward to teaching next fall. And then I wanted to share with you sort of how my next year will look like as I prepare and as I settle into my role. So my goals are to build relationships, meet as many people as I can that are here in Maine and involved in dairy production within the Northeast as well, and then conduct a needs assessment. So part of this and part of meeting people is trying to understand what the research needs are. So this will help me in building my programs and conducting research that is directly applicable to the needs of Maine dairy producers, as well as dairy producers in the Northeast. So when I'm going out to dairy farms, which I've been doing for the past couple of months, in interacting with producers and with dairy businesses, I'm looking to try to understand what the needs are, and not only what the current needs are, but what the future needs of the dairy industry in Maine are. And so I'm asking a lot of those questions to try to understand and how I can build on my program and on my research to address the future needs as well, because the dairy industry is always evolving. And then I wanted to share my personal goal, because this is sort of what drives me and what motivates me as a person. So I was on a pre-vet track at the University of Rhode Island because I really wanted to help improve animal health and management. And once I had that experience as an undergraduate conducting research at the University of Minnesota, I said, well, I can still improve animal health and management, and that might look differently. And so I decided to, instead of going to vet school, pursue a master's and a PhD. And so this personal goal will sort of, it is part of my my drive, and it'll integrate really well in my role as the dairy specialist. And so now I wanted to share a little bit about the research that I've conducted previously. I want to share that this research was done as I was in grad school. So this research and a lot of the methods behind the research were under the supervision of my PhD advisor, Dr. Brad Hines. And I look forward to conducting my own research here as I settle in my role. So I was really fortunate to spend a lot of my graduate experience at the West Central Research and Outreach Center, and that's what this acronym stands for, WCROC, West Central Research and Outreach Center. And this research center is unique because there are two production systems, organic and conventional, under the same operation. So this research center is part of the University of Minnesota. And it's located in West Central Minnesota and Morris, Minnesota as well. And so we have an organic dairy herd where there are about 120 cows that are milking 40 pounds per milk per day. And these cows graze during summer months, and they're rotated on a 2-day basis. And then in the winter, because in Minnesota, the temperatures tend to be more cold than here in the Northeast. So when it freezes, and I'm learning that here there's it'll freeze, but then it'll thaw, and sort of has this not consistent weather pattern here in the Northeast. I'm learning a little bit about that as well. And so those cows are fed TMR during the winter time. And then the conventional herd has a separate bulk tank from the organic herd, but there are about 160 cows with an average production of 60 pounds of milk. And these cows are housed in an outdoor lot in a straw bedded pack, as depicted here in this picture. So they are outdoors. That's why they are considered a low input conventional system. And then additionally, this herd is not only unique because it has two production systems under the same operation, but there are purebreds in addition to crossbreds. So we have purebred Holsteins. These are your modern day Holsteins. But then there was this fun lineage of Holsteins from 1964. So these cows are used as part of research in an experiment to sort of compare cows in 1964 to modern day cows. So I like to say that they are frozen in time. And then we do have two crossbreeding rotations. One is Pro Cross that has Holstein, Viking Red, and Montbéliarde in the rotation, and those are all dairy breeds. And then we have another rotation that's called Grace Cross, where there are Jersey, Viking Red, and Normandy dairy breeds. And so a lot of the research that I've been able to conduct has been within crossbreeding. And I wanted to show some of the cows that we have on this dairy operation. So we have purebred Holsteins. This cow was in her first lactation. We do have the Pro Cross. So these are cows that have Viking Red, Holstein, and Montbéliarde dairy breeds. So this is a Pro Cross cow, a crossbred cow, and this cow was in her fourth lactation. This cow is in her first lactation, but she is Montbéliarde sire. And one of the unique characteristics of the Montbéliarde, in addition to their fat and protein content, is that they do tend to carry a bit more condition compared to the more traditionally US-based dairy breeds, such as the Holstein or the Jersey. And then the Grace crossbreeding rotation includes cows that are sired by Jersey, Normandy, and Viking Red, and specifically this cow is Jersey sired. As you can see, there are some key characteristics of Jersey in her with the coat coloring. This cow was in her second lactation. And this cow that is Normandy sired is a crossbred, but she is Normandy, Viking Red, Jersey. And an indication of the Normandy breed is that they have this brindle-like color. So that leads me to this slide where we have seen sort of a shift in the breed composition of cows on milk recording. So I took this data. This data is available by the Council on Dairy Cattle Breeding, and this data is reflective of the cows on milk recording. So not all of the cows in the U.S. are milk recording. There's about 40% of the cows in the U.S. that are on milk recording. And in this graph, we have the cows that are percent Holstein on milk recording. And then on this right y-axis, we have all of the other cows that are not Holstein that are on milk recording. So over the past 10 years, we see that the number of Holstein cows on milk recording, and that's depicted here in this triangle line, we've seen that there's been a decrease in the number of cows that are Holstein, but there's been an increase in the cows that are other. That would be Jersey, Brown Swiss, Ayrshire, Milking Shorthorn. And then we also see that there's an increase in the number of cows that are crossbred as well. And so I think it was important to show this because this drove a lot of the research that we've been conducted to sort of just have more research and to help producers when making those management decisions, and to have more research available for other breeds outside of Holstein and including Holstein. And then that leads me to say that we have done a lot of research with dairy breeds, and specifically this one research study that we collaborated on with folks at Penn State, Dr. Chad Deckel and Dr. Lydia Hardy. And so there was some data from DHIA specifically within, and there was a lot of data that actually came from the Northeast. So I wanted to highlight this research study that we did. And we looked at the sire predicted transmitting abilities for production and fertility traits in the US of organic jerseys specifically. And so the predicted transmitting ability is a term given to estimate the genetic merit of that sire to that cow. So we regressed daughter records. So we took a lot of daughter records from the Northeast and other states, and we regressed those on what their sire PTA was. So we were trying to understand if a sire has a certain PTA, is that being expressed, genetically expressed in that cow or on that daughter, specifically within the Jersey breed and for organic dairy herds. And so the reason why we wanted to look at this data, specifically the Jersey data, was because within this data set, the Jerseys were the second most popular purebred breed. So we have a large percentage of those herds had Holstein cows, followed by crossbred cows and Jersey purebred cows. So this is in organic herds only. Again, I just wanted to make sure. And then, like I mentioned, a lot of that data came from the Northeast. So this is the breakdown of the states that were, some of the states that were included in that data set, with Pennsylvania, Vermont, and New York making up a large percentage of that data for those organic Jersey cows. So as I mentioned, this study was done during my graduate degree. So this data was not the most recent data. So there was a sire evaluation this December 2021. And this data that we have here is from December of 2018. And to reflect the study that was done during that time frame. So we took daughter records from cows that calved from 2012 to 2017, and we had data from 31 organic herds. And this data set was made up of about 5,000 Jersey cows. And within that, there was cows that were sired by about 100 bulls. And so here's a table of the number of daughters per sire for the top 10 sires within this data set. We could pull a really long list of all the sires, so we just pulled the top 10. And so we can see here that these are the sire names and then their NAB code, as well as the number of daughters that they sired. So it is sorted by the number of daughters. And I just wanted to sort of bring your attention to the net merit aspect. So net merit is an index that a lot of producers select their sires on because it includes a lot of the functional traits that dairy producers are looking to have on their dairy operation. And so the net merit for these sires averaged from negative $53 to $278. And then based on the daughter pregnancy rate here, we can see that there was a lot of sires that maybe didn't have the best DPR. And so the DPR was lower for the sires that came from this data set. And then just to sort of put it into perspective, an increase, a 1 unit increase in DPR means that that cow has four fewer days open. So, for example, when we're comparing the PTA DPR for this sire compared to this sire, a 1 unit increase means that that cow is expected to have 4 fewer days open. And we know that's important for profitability on dairy farms. So in this table here, I just have some of the descriptive data of the cows on this data set. So again, this is from 5,000 Jersey cows in organic herds. And this data is the 305 mature equivalent. So the mean for those cows for production was about 17,000 pounds. And then for fat and protein, we had 820 pounds as well as 624 pounds. And then again, we were looking at days open for this data set to address the fertility. So on average, there was 136 days open. And just to give you a little bit of reference, the US national average for Jerseys for mature equivalent for production is about 20,000 pounds. For fat is about 980 pounds. And for protein is about 750 pounds. But the days open average is around 115 pounds, and some of this data was from CDCB. So let's talk about our results and what we found in this data set. When we regressed those daughter records on their sire PTAs, what we were trying to understand was what's the relationship in terms of how do those cows, how do they express their genetic potential. So when you think about genetic selection, right, we use a sire based on traits that we want to see in our dairy operation. And so when we do that, it's important to see, well, is what the sire PTAs are saying reflective on the daughter records? And that's what we were trying to understand here. So for milk, fat, protein, and somatic cell score, we were expecting a coefficient of 1, and that says that yes, the daughters are expressing their genetic potential on these dairy herds from the data set that we had. And so we can see that for the most part, the coefficient that we calculated based on the daughter records is very close to that coefficient of 1. However, for the somatic cell score, that coefficient was lower. And so this warrants maybe some improvement in selecting for somatic cell score. So the daughters weren't expressing their genetic potential based on what the sire PTAs were. And then, like I mentioned, when we talk about fertility, we did that by looking at days open. And again, a 1 increase in PTA for a daughter pregnancy rate indicates that the cow will have 4 fewer days open so when we're talking about sires, it's, a sire comparing sire to sire, a 1 unit increase in DPR means that there's 4 less days open. And so when we expected a coefficient of -4, but the coefficient that we calculated for this data set was -3. So we think that there's an opportunity for selecting for a sire or bulls that maybe have fewer days open in organic dairy herds. And so there's a real opportunity here. And so in conclusion, and to sort of to what I described already, we saw that for the production traits, that the organic Jersey cows tended to express their genetic potential based on the sire PTAs and the data set that we have here. But we did see an opportunity for 4 days open. And so potentially there just needs to be more research and more efforts related to genetic improvement of days open and fertility for organic Jersey cows. And of course, I want to first thank all of the collaborators of the research that I mentioned previously. So my PhD advisor, Dr. Brett Hines, as well as my colleagues, Kirsten Sharp, and my co-advisor, Dr. Les Hansen, and then collaborators at Penn State, Dr. Chad Deckow and Dr. Lydia Hardy. And with that, I hope that you found this useful, and I hope that this sort of gave you a bit of an understanding of who I am and what some of my research interests are. And then if you have any questions, I'd love to chat. And if you just want to say, hey, nice to meet you, my name is so-and-so, I love that as well, as I'm getting familiar with folks here in Maine. So you can contact me at glenda.pereira@maine.edu, or contact me in my phone number at 207-581-3240. So I look forward to an opportunity to meet you. Thanks so much.